What happened to female pirates after capture or standing on the creaking, sun-warped boards of a rotting Caribbean dock sometime in the early 18th century? The air is humid, thick with salt and sweat and the distant cawing of gulls. Around you, men pace barefoot in threadbare linen, shouting at one another in rough English, Dutch, and Portuguese. But you are not one of them. You're a woman, dressed in a patched waistcoat, your hair hidden under a stained tricorn hat, and you are not supposed to be here. The truth is, many women were never supposed to be here. When most people think of female pirates, the names Anne Bonny and Mary Read come to mind and little else. But they weren't alone. While the stories of swashbuckling women tend to be reduced to myth or novelty, the reality is more complicated and more mundane. Throughout the golden age of piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, there were dozens of documented and many undocumented cases of women at sea posing as men, working as cooks, surgeons, even captains. They were tolerated, ignored, or hidden until they were caught. And that's where the story really begins. Women at sea were illegal on most vessels. The superstition ran deep. Women on ships were said to bring bad luck. But women went anyway, some willingly, some out of necessity. Disguised as men, they scrubbed decks, loaded cannonballs, tended to wounded sailors, and sailed into combat. The decision to become a pirate wasn't always one of thrill or rebellion. It was sometimes one of survival. In some cases, women followed lovers to sea. In others, they fled abusive marriages, unwanted pregnancies, or rigid gender roles. Piracy offered anonymity, power, and something very rare for a woman in the 1700s, choice. But when female pirates were discovered, especially if they were captured after a naval battle, their treatment diverged sharply from that of their male counterparts. In many cases, women were tried not just as pirates, but also for defying the gender norms of the time. While men were often hanged swiftly and publicly, women's fates were drawn out. Some were jailed indefinitely while courts debated what to do. Others were sent to convents or workhouses. The legal system didn't know where to place them. Should they be punished more harshly as deceptive and immoral, or should they be pitied, reabsorbed into the folds of domestic life? The story of Mary Read offers a glimpse into the chaos that followed capture. Disguised as a man, she sailed with Anne Bonny aboard Calico Jack Rackham's crew. When the crew was captured by English authorities in 1720, both women were sentenced to hang, but they pleaded the belly, a legal delay granted to pregnant women. It worked. Their executions were postponed. Mary died in prison shortly after, possibly of fever or complications from childbirth. And Bonny's fate remains uncertain. Some believe her wealthy father arranged for her release, and that she lived out the rest of her life under a different name. But for the dozens of unnamed women captured alongside male pirates, the stories were even duller. There are court transcripts filled with statements like was found aboard dressed as a man, and did not speak when questioned, or was kept in irons until her sex was discovered. In some cases, female pirates were assumed to be kidnapped, hostages, even if they insisted otherwise. This confusion worked both for and against them. Some were let go with no punishment, others were executed anyway, accused of moral corruption rather than piracy itself. Punishments varied by region. In the Caribbean colonies, especially Jamaica and Barbados, female prisoners were often treated as moral threats rather than political ones. Officials fretted over their influence on other women. A captured female pirate might find herself in a squalid local jail, then transferred to a house of correction, where she'd spend her days spinning thread or washing linens under harsh supervision. These punishments were designed not only to reform, but to erase. And it wasn't just the British. The Spanish treated female pirates harshly, especially if they were found aboard ships attacking Catholic holdings. One Spanish account from 1715 describes a woman captured off the coast of Florida who was tortured until she revealed the names of her crew. She died during the process. Her name was never recorded. In truth, most captured female pirates didn't leave behind dramatic last words or grand tales. They faded if they were lucky. They were allowed to reintegrate into society. If not, they were imprisoned, executed quietly, or forced into labor until their identities and lives were forgotten. Still, records survive, scattered among court ledgers, letters from colonial governors, and the logs of military captains are brief mentions, sometimes no more than a sentence of women found armed on pirate ships. A woman sentenced to 10 years in Kingston for dressing like a sailor and giving orders. Another lashed 30 times and sent to a plantation as a servant, and another, unnamed, who claimed she had been raised on a ship and knew no other life. Their stories are less about high seas drama and more about what happens after the curtain falls. What becomes of a woman whose only crime was living a life that wasn't allowed? Because here's the truth most history books skip. For many women who turned to piracy, the danger wasn't battle, it was what came after. What do you do when the sea no longer protects you? And more curiously, how many of these women never got caught at all? You are now in a cell. Not the damp, stone-walled dungeon you might expect, but a narrow wooden chamber in Port Royal, Jamaica. The light filters through cracks in the timber, slats, and you can hear the muffled sounds of the harbor rope straining, sailors shouting, barrels rolling. You are not alone. There are 3 other women, all of you arrested after the seizure of a small sloop suspected of piracy. The air smells of mold and old salt. You haven't been told what your charges are. You haven't seen a magistrate. You wait for many captured female pirates. This was reality. After the moment of capture, often violent, sometimes chaotic, the real ordeal began in custody. The interrogation process was rarely straightforward. Most women were not tried solely for piracy, but for a tangle of social and legal transgressions. Gender played an unspoken but central role in how their cases unfolded. Courts didn't just want to know what you had done. They wanted to know who you were, why you were dressed as a man, why you carried weapons, whether you had slept with any of the crew, if you were pregnant, if your parents were respectable, if you had ever worked as a prostitute. These questions weren't just legal, they were moral. In the 18th century, a woman's place in society was rigidly defined. Female pirates did not just threaten maritime law, they threatened an entire worldview. Take the case of Rachel Wall, one of the few female pirates tried in the American colonies. Captured in Boston in 1789, she was accused of robbery and piracy, although the latter charge was vague and somewhat inflated. During her trial, the court fixated on her character, her refusal to conform, her insolent tone, her unnatural lack of shame. She was sentenced to hang, but not just for her crimes at sea. The newspaper coverage made clear that her execution was meant to serve as a warning to other rebellious women. In other cases, female pirates were treated almost theatrically during interrogations. Anne Bonny and Mary Read became media sensations. Their trial widely reported in colonial newspapers. Accounts noted Anne's fiery temper, Mary's calm demeanor, their mannish dress and strange ways of speaking. It's easy to romanticize these details now, but at the time, they were used as evidence of deviance. Their gender made their actions shocking, their boldness unforgivable. More often, however, female pirates faded into the bureaucratic background. Once captured, they were transferred from ship to shore, usually under armed guard, and jailed until a court date could be arranged. The logistics of housing women caused problems. Most jails weren't equipped for female prisoners. Sometimes women were held in local taverns or private homes under supervision, especially if they were seen as less dangerous. Others were confined to rooms and forts, chained to keep them from fleeing. While male pirates were usually tried swiftly and executed within days or weeks, women could linger in limbo. Their cases moved slowly, bogged down by legal uncertainty and social discomfort. A woman who had committed piracy, Who had worn trousers and carried a pistol? Was she mad, possessed, or just unusually wicked? This confusion meant many women spent long stretches awaiting judgment. Some were ultimately released with little fanfare, especially if they were young or claimed to have been coerced. Others were exiled, sent back to England or France to be dealt with. Far from the colonies, a few were quietly married off, as if domesticity could erase their crimes. But some women remained in prison for years, often under miserable conditions. Letters from colonial governors complain about female offenders too dangerous for release, yet unsuitable for the gallows. One 1713 report from Kingston mentions a woman who had been held for 11 months because no magistrate wished to try her case. Her name is not recorded. And then there were the ones who died before a verdict could be reached. Conditions in colonial jails were brutal, cells were overcrowded, often infested with rats and lice. Clean water was scarce and tropical. Diseases spread quickly. Women rarely received proper medical care. If a woman claimed to be pregnant, jailers might give her slightly better treatment, more food, less restraint, but only until her condition could be confirmed or denied. Some women used pregnancy as a form of resistance. The so-called plea of the belly became a legal strategy. Courts in England and its colonies could not execute a pregnant woman. Doing so was considered morally and spiritually abhorrent. So, when faced with death, some female pirates claimed to be pregnant whether they were or not. To verify this, a jury of matrons would be convened. This was a panel of married women, typically midwives or respectable housewives, who would examine the accused and report their findings. The process was humiliating but effective. If a woman was found to be quick with child, meaning fetal movement had been detected, her execution would be delayed in some cases. This bought her enough time for a pardon to be arranged. But the plea was not a guarantee of mercy. Some women gave birth in prison only to be hanged afterward. Others died in childbirth, alone and shackled. Still others saw their children taken from them and sent to orphanages or convents. The system made no provision for what came next for those women who survived prison. Life after captivity was rarely easy. Branded as criminals, they struggled to reintegrate into society. In some port towns, a woman suspected of piracy might be forbidden from taking work in taverns, ships, or marketplaces. Others fled inland, hoping to escape the stigma. A few found sympathetic allies, judges, priests, even former crewmates who helped them start over under new names. But most simply disappeared from the record. The lives of these women challenge our sense of historical narrative. They weren't queens or rebels or heroines. They weren't even particularly successful pirates. In most cases, they were cooks, sailors, nurses, thieves. They wore trousers and swore and got drunk and carried daggers in their boots. They made a series of small, practical decisions that led them onto ships and then into cells. And still the question lingered in the minds of judges and chroniclers: were these women evil or just lost? To answer the question, one must understand what drove them to piracy in the first place. Was it poverty? Was it love? Was it rebellion? Or could it be that the sea offered something no land ever could? A place where you could be someone else, even if only for a while. But how long can you pretend? When every port has eyes, you're in a crowded, sun-bleached market somewhere in the Caribbean. The year is 1724. A woman passes you, carrying a sack of dried fish over her shoulder. Her face is weather-worn, her hands calloused, her stride confident. No one pays her any special attention. But a closer look reveals something strange. A faded tattoo on her forearm and anchor, crudely done. It's not a sailor's mark. It's not quite respectable. You've seen it before. But where? She doesn't look back. For many female pirates who survived capture, this was their ultimate fate, not death, not fame, but fading into civilian life, blending in, keeping their heads down in fishing villages, dockside kitchens, or the back rooms of taverns. Some lived out their years in obscurity, no longer pirates, but never quite welcome in the world of ordinary women, either. This final act, the life after piracy, is perhaps the quietest and most revealing. While popular imagination dwells on gallows, gunpowder, and gold, the truth is that most pirates, male or female, died of disease, hunger, or betrayal. But for women who were captured and spared, whether by pleading pregnancy, escaping prison, or simply being overlooked, the post-piracy world was complicated. Some were reabsorbed into society under strict conditions in Port Royal and Havana. For example, records show women arrested for piracy who were later found married to local sailors or soldiers, living quiet lives. These women usually had to promise never to associate with known criminals again, and more importantly, to resume appropriate feminine conduct. A few were forcibly resettled in colonies far from where they were caught. Authorities believed that placing former female pirates in unfamiliar communities might limit their chances of returning to crime. In practice, it meant exile in all but name. One document from the Colonial Office in 1721 refers to a woman formerly apprehended, with sea thieves being sent to British Honduras to work in a textile house. Her name was recorded only as Margaret D., widow. Even among those who escaped legal punishment, life was not exactly forgiving. Many found themselves trapped between worlds, too infamous to be trusted, too poor to go elsewhere, too different to ever really fit back into the domestic molds of wife or servant. Their former crewmates, if still alive, rarely kept in touch. Brotherhoods at sea rarely translated to loyalty on land. 1732 report from Nassau mentions a female sea rogue who ran a small alehouse, occasionally slipping coins to local girls looking to escape their own grim domestic arrangements. She may have once been a pirate, or maybe she only said she had been. Even then, truth and story had already begun to blend. Of course, some of these women didn't simply vanish into domestic anonymity, they carved new lives out of what they had left. A few took up trade work, seamstresses, fishmongers, midwives, skills learned at sea, bandaging wounds, repairing sails. Managing drunk men transferred surprisingly well. In this way, the pirate life didn't end. It simply shifted form. In the port of Brest, France, a 1740 census listed Jean L., age 51, occupation, tailor of maritime cloth, no husband, no children. When a visiting British official questioned her about
her accent and old naval slang, she laughed and told him, "I used to be better company before I found land." Was she a pirate? Was she just eccentric? The records don't care. But what happens when even those small traces are erased? The story of female pirates after capture is also a story of historical silence. Over time, their names were dropped from ledgers, their trials forgotten, their deaths unremarked. They were not important enough for statues, too deviant for sainthood, too ordinary to romanticize. So history moved on without them. A few lingered in folklore, ghost stories told in coastal towns, or whispered warnings to unruly girls. You'll end up like the pirate woman. But most became shadows in the margins of maritime records, footnotes in the history of empires. Even the most famous Anne Bonny, Mary Read are known primarily because their lives intersected with men who left clearer paper trails. Remove the name of Calico Jack Rackham from the record, and Anne Bonny becomes just another illegible note in a colonial jail log. And yet, something remains. There are strange hints of survival scattered throughout the Atlantic world. In church registers, an Anne be marrying a merchant in Charleston. In Jamaican property rolls, a Miss R. acquiring a goat farm 2 decades after her supposed death. In oral traditions passed down in Newfoundland and the Azores, The tales of sea wives who knew too much about rigging to have been ordinary fishers' daughters. Could they be the same women? We'll never know, but the ambiguity is part of what makes this history quietly radical. These women didn't shape nations or write constitutions. They didn't command fleets. They didn't even win. But they lived. They lived in defiance of rules that said they could not exist. They challenged an entire order simply by surviving. Their lives remind us that resistance isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like peeling potatoes in a coastal tavern with tattooed fingers. Sometimes it looks like a woman slipping away from the gallows, taking a job as a washerwoman, and never speaking of the sea again. Sometimes it looks like silence. The records we do have brief, reluctant, often scornful are not mistakes. They are the system straining to erase what it cannot explain. Because how do you punish someone whose only real crime was refusing to be what the world expected? And perhaps more unsettling, how many of them are still unaccounted for? How many simply walked ashore, changed their name, and kept walking? Alcohol in the ancient world, you lean your elbows on a low clay counter a makeshift bar. Really somewhere in the city of yore, around 2100 BCE, the room smells of wet grain and river. Mud. Light filters through a reed mat roof, catching motes of dust that drift above wide-bellied jars sunk into the packed earth floor. A woman with a copper pin holding her plaited hair lifts a dipper of cloudy, amber liquid from one jar and lets it sluice into a shallow bowl. She pushes it toward you with a practiced flick of the wrist. No froth, no heady aroma of hops, just the faint tartness of half-fermented barley and the ghost of baked bread. You sip through a straw of hollow reed. The only way to bypass the floating husks and taste. Beneath the sourness, a flicker of sweetness. It is beer, but nothing like the modern word suggests. It is food and payment and ritual, medicine and mild escape, all in one slurry. Around you, scribes with reed pens trade tablets for bowls. Brickmakers fresh from kilns tip there, wages straight into their throats. Somewhere beyond the doorway, on a sun-baked cigarette step, a priest chants praise to Ninkasi, goddess of brewing, who sim doubles as the recipe you now taste. Soak the grain, bake the loaves, mash, cool, wait. The humble origins of intoxication. Story is older than writing, and almost as old as settled life itself. Chemical traces and pottery from Jiahu, China, hint at mixed fruit and grain wines 11,000 years ago, long before the first plough cut a furrow. In the South Caucasus, grape residues clinging to Neolithic jars speak of wine as early as 6000 BCE. But it is in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates that the first bureaucrats begin to count it, tax it, and worry about it. Clay tablets tallied rations of beer distributed to temple workers, from the king's baker down to the lowest basket carrier. A laborer's allotment might be 2 sile, about a litre per day. A palace singer could hope for 5 at first. No sharp line divides drink from food. Beer, in Sumerian, is kos, a liquid strain of bread kept alive by wild yeast. Brew women, often widows or priestesses, run the taverns. Their livelihood is coveted, yet suspect enough to draw the eye of lawmakers. When Babylon rises on the Euphrates a millennium later, King Hammurabi sets down his famous code, and among the eye for an eye clauses nestle quieter rules. Section 108. If a tavern keeper, female, refuses grain in payment for beer, but accepts only silver, or if she shortchanges the measure of beer, she is to be drowned, drowning in the very drink she adulterated. The punishment reveals two anxieties at once: cheating the state of its grain and letting women grow to independent behind clay counters. Egypt, beer for the afterlife. Beer for the day shifts slip west along dusty caravan tracks, and you arrive on the Nile some 5 centuries later. Here, beer is henkered, brewed from half-baked loaves mashed in river water. Pyramid builders, contrary to the old myth of whipped slaves, are mostly paid laborers, and part of their wage about 4 liters per day's beer. Wall paintings show porters lifting amphorae onto sledges bound for a tomb. The dead must drink. 2. In brewing courtyards, women stir vats with tamarisk paddles, singing to quicken the yeast the way. You might hum to coax a child to sleep. One autumn evening you find yourself in a village near Thebes at the Feast of Hathor, goddess of love and drunkenness. Torches flare, flutes keen, jars empty faster than scribes can count. Tipsiness here is divine imitation. Hathor once saved humanity by bloodily punishing its hubris, but she relented only when beer dyed with pomegranate juice tricked her into thinking more blood pooled at her feet. She drank, grew playful, and humanity survived. So Egyptians drink to remember the day beer saved the world from its own undoing. Across continents, millet, honey, and sorghum travel, east again farther than most traders dare down. The Shang. Caught in Bronze Age, China drinks Ju, a fermented blend of rice, millet, and honey ladled from bronze vessels that sweat in humid summer nights. The oracle bone inscriptions read like ration lists. How many jars sent to which ancestor during a tomb feast? How much millet diverted from tax stores to brewery granaries? Drunkenness is ancestor veneration, but also social glue. To refuse a cup at court is to refuse kinship with the living and the dead. Southward, in what will one day be Ethiopia, highland farmers discover that honey mixed with rainwater ferments. To make tej, in West Africa, sorghum beer foams in calabash bowls. None of these cultures share a language, but all share yeast quiet, invisible, endlessly industrious. Wherever grain meets water and time, fermentation follows, unbidden. The tipping point is not invention, but acceptance, deciding the souring. Mash is not spoiled grain, but a doorway to something gently intoxicating, Greece and Rome. Dilution and discipline by the 6th century BCE, hop across the Aegean and arrive at a Greek symposium. You recline on a cline, elbow propped on a cushion. A slave boy mixes wine with water in a broad-bellied crater. For to drink wine, neat is barbaric a Scythian habit that marks lack of self-control. Conversation here is a contest of wit and memory, lubricated by carefully moderated inebriation. To sober, and you risk seeming dull. To drunk, and you stagger into shame. The host appoints a symposiarch, a kind of booze umpire, to judge each round's dilution ratio. 3 parts. Water to 1 wine for leisurely talk. Lighter still if politics intrudes. The Romans inherit the vine and industrialize it. Hillsides, from Hispania to Asia Minor, bristle with trellises. Harvests fill amphorae, stamped with each estate's mark. By the late Republic, Rome imports so much cheap wine that senators fret over moral decay. Sumptuary laws try to restrain quantity and banish foreign vintages. They fail. Even legionaries on the Rhine have their ration, though often in the form of poscassar, wine cut with vinegar and water, thought to kill river-borne germs. It tastes better than it sounds if you're thirsty enough.
The mundane mechanics of ferment step away from palaces back into cellars and storehouses, and the romance drains. Brewing and venting are mostly patient drudgery, scrubbing residue from jars. Praying the seasonal yeast swarm will start the new batch, skimming dead insects off cooling must. Patching the clay lining of a dolia vat before a leak drains a year's wages into the dirt. Spoilage's constant threat is acetic acid, mold, rodents, and so are taxes. In Athens, a drone-like public slave checks tavern measures in the Han capital. A Sultandir monopolist records every jar on bamboo slips, ensuring the state's cut. Preservation tricks evolve. Pine resin smeared on amphora stoppers giving Greek ricina its bite. Boiled down grape syrup defrutum added as sweetener. And mild antiseptic. Rose petals layered atop beer mash in Mesopotamia to mask bitterness of wild yeasts. None of it guarantees consistency. No two batches taste alike. Drinkers develop local loyalties. City market beer for daily thirst. Temple festival strong brew. For holy days. Falernian for Roman senator's boast. Murky gullish for the dock worker. When drink becomes identity cows, alcohol is calorie, paycheck, and mild narcotic in one. Sobriety is a rarity. A Mesopotamian worker who forfeits his beer ration is effectively unpaid. An Egyptian who refuses festival ale risks being seen as impious. Even Greek philosophers who sneer at drunks still toast the gods with watered wine. Temperance only emerges when resources tighten or morality shifts. Spartan black broth replaces regular wine. Early Christian ascetics trade amphory for visionary fasting. Yet old habits linger. Monks of late antiquity soon brew again. Harnessing yeast for both sacrament and supper. Foreshadowing medieval beer culture. An unresolved cast so you drain the last of your barley sludge in her. Wipe foam from your lip in. Thebes, tip a bronze kylix in Athens, and sniff tart posca on a legionary camp's rampart. The tastes differ: husky grain, sweet grape, sour mash, but the thread is unbroken. Fermentation turns fragile harvests into storable calories. And blurred edges of consciousness, it sustains workers. Oils diplomacy, feeds tax systems, and studies. Nerves before battle. Yet behind every cup lingers a question: if drinking was so embedded, so ordinary. That whole economy's paid wages in beer and armies marched on watered wine. What did sobriety even mean to the ancients? Could anyone truly choose abstinence in a world where water alone was suspect? And a foaming jar meant both sustenance and social belonging. And more provocatively, when alcohol was woven into law codes, rituals, and daily bread, where did sacred intoxication end and quiet addiction begin? You stand beneath a linen canopy on a limestone terrace overlooking Jerusalem. Around the 10th century BCE, the air smells of thyme and dust. Below, laborers unload clay jars from donkeys' slender amphories sealed with wax and sloshing with a dark, spicy wine from coastal vineyards. The scribe beside you carefully counts each jar and marks a clay tablet with a blunt reed. These aren't just beverages. They're offerings, taxes, status. This shipment, like many before it, is destined, not for feasting but for the temple storerooms, and eventually for the altar. Alcohol in this world is not recreation, it is ritual, bureaucracy. A gesture of submission wrapped in the comfort of familiarity. Wine is now a tool of kingship. It is consumed at court not only to delight, but to define one's place. How much you receive, how pure it is, how quickly it flows from the steward's hand, all of it speaks to your status, your nearness to the divine, or to royal favor. In kingdoms from Judah to Assyria, wine marks the difference between servant and noble, guest and supplicant, priest and criminal. And the temple is more than a place of prayer, it is a state organ, managing both sacred ceremony and agricultural supply chains. Here, wine is poured out as libation beside the blood of goats, mixed into bread dough for holy days, and stored in thick-walled cellars as part of a divine economy. These drinks are no longer household brews made from leftover bread. They are carefully managed resources, grown in royal vineyards, guarded by soldiers, and distributed with bureaucratic precision. To be drunk is no longer simply to be merry, it is, increasingly, to be watched, Across the Mediterranean, similar stories unfold. In Hittite Anatolia, records speak of beer and wine both used in state rituals. Kings did not merely drink, they performed drinking. They raised goblets of wine toward storm gods and earth deities, and scribes recorded it all in cuneiform. These ceremonies weren't spontaneous acts of revelry, but scripted events designed to maintain cosmic balance. The king's toast mirrored the rising of crops. His satisfaction with the vintage mirrored the god's satisfaction with his rule. At the same time, laws regulated how much drink could be issued to workers, how much could be sold in taverns, and how much had to be reserved for state functions. Nothing about it was casual, and yet the more institutionalized alcohol became, the more it spread into the corners of society. In places like Mycenaean Greece, huge quantities of wine passed through palace storehouses kept not in clay jars alone, but in immense bronze cauldrons. These vessels weren't just practical, they were statements of power. To host a feast and have wine enough to fill one was to perform wealth. To water it down just right was to perform civilization. To drink it unmixed was to flirt with wildness. By the time classical Greece emerges from the ashes of the Bronze Age collapse, alcohol is thoroughly entangled with philosophy, law, and gender. In Athens, men gather in the symposium to drink wine, diluted 3 parts water to 1. The goal is not drunkenness but discussion. These evenings could stretch for hours, punctuated by flutes, riddles, and political banter. Drinking the slowly marked you as cold or secretive. Drinking the quickly made you foolish. It was not how much you drank, but how you behaved. Moderation was civilization, and it was strictly a male domain. Respectable women were not to be seen drunk, nor even in the presence of alcohol outside religious festivals. If you were a woman and found in a symposium, you were assumed to be ahead of your companion, clever, and cultured, but always an outsider. Yet even as drinking was policed, it also served as a kind of release valve. The festival of Dionysus turned rules on their heads. Actors wore masks and women danced in wild abandon. The wine flowed freely, and for one sacred season, chaos was not only allowed, it was demanded. Yet even this chaos was choreographed. There were officials, processions, quotas. Even the wildest celebrations had a schedule. In this way, alcohol became the tool through which a society could let itself go briefly, safely, and then return to order. By the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire stretched from the Aegean to the Indus, and alcohol traveled with it not only wine, but date, palm beer, pomegranate wines, and honey liquors. Persian kings were known for lavish drinking customs, often portrayed by Greek writers as indulgent or decadent. But Persian etiquette was meticulous. Wine was served in stages, guests were ranked, and sobriety among officials was expected, even as the elite toasted at banquets. In Persepolis, drinking was architectural. Reliefs showed delegations offering jars of wine as tribute. Each jug bore inscriptions, identifying its origin and content. In the storerooms of the Apadana inventory, lists detail precise amounts distributed to builders, soldiers, and administrators. Alcohol here was empire in liquid form. Every cup poured in the palace represented dozens of tributary peoples. Elamites who pressed the grapes, Lydians who glazed the jugs, scribes who tracked each measure. The king drank not just wine but the labor of an empire. And even in more modest settings, drinking marked your position. In smaller towns and villages, rations of fermented grain beer were issued to soldiers and workers in state employ. One Elamite tablet notes precisely that a stonemason received 2 measures of beer daily, plus 1 extra on festival days. These details seem bureaucratic, even dull, but they tell us that intoxication wasn't merely permitted. It was managed. It was predictable. And its predictability helped empires run. But in every culture, no matter how tightly alcohol was controlled, it always threatened to spill over, sometimes literally. In Egypt, there are letters from priests complaining about acolytes who drank the sacred wine before it reached the Altered in Mesopotamia. Temple records no losses from broken jars and improper consumption during deliveries. In Greece, comic playwrights turned drunken philosophers into punchlines. And in Rome, where wine was so plentiful it became cheaper than water in some cities, alcohol became a mirror, reflecting anxieties about class, gender, and control. By the 2nd century BCE, Roman elites began to push back. Moralists like Cato, the elder, warned of wine's corrosive power, especially among women. A law was proposed to ban women from even possessing wine without a male guardian in public. Roman senators toasted in moderation, but in private, the banquet sprawled. And vomiting was not taboo, but ritual. The contradictions multiplied. Wine was civilizing, but also corrupting. It was a right, but also a danger. It made Rome strong and made it weak. And so you find yourself once more at the edge of a banquet, listening to cups clink and words slur. Somewhere nearby, a clerk records how many jugs were open, who poured, who drank too quickly, who slipped out with a full vessel and returned empty-handed. In the ancient world, alcohol was not merely a personal indulgence. It was a collective performance. It revealed things about power, about order, about how much freedom a person had, or pretended to have. Drinking was always public, even when done in private, and as the empires grew more complex, so did their drinking rituals until it became hard to say where the sacred ended and the political began. But if alcohol was a tool of power, a mirror of the state, a way to celebrate, or to forget, then what happened when that mirror cracked? What became of people or whole societies when drinking ceased to mean structure and began instead to mean escape? The sun sinks behind a ruined fortress in what was once the western fringe of the Roman Empire. You sit by a low fire with a small band of villagers woodcutters, a former auxiliary soldier, a widow tending a sheepdog sharing a jug of thin, smoky wine pressed from wild grapes. The jug is hand-thrown and unmarked. There are no imperial seals, no vineyard stamps. The wine is rough, barely filtered, half turned to vinegar. But it warms your chest and quiets the night's chill. This is not a feast. It is not ritual. It is survival, and it is what remains when empires fall. After the collapse of Rome in the West, state wine production fractured into local economies. Vineyards once managed by bureaucrats or elite villas now passed into the hands of monasteries. Local chieftains or vanished altogether. Trade shrank, roads decayed. Amphorae were replaced with wooden barrels or animal skin bags. What remained was memory and the urge to keep fermenting, no matter how quietly. The early medieval period is sometimes called a dark age, but the fermentation never stopped. In scattered hilltop farms and valley abbeys, small-scale brewing and vending quietly endured. Recipes changed, flavors dulled or sharpened with new ingredients. But the impulse to turn grain into beer and grape into wine remained as steady as breath died in Gaul. Irish missionaries brought not only scripture but brewing knowledge, copying old Roman fermentation techniques into new margins. In the forests of Germania, local tribes developed meads and barley beers entirely apart from Roman norms, influenced more by season and herb availability than by Dionysian tradition. Meanwhile, in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines maintained a more continuous relationship with wine. Their vineyards continued to produce under state supervision, though now often under Christian symbolism. Wine was now the blood of Christ, no longer the gift of Bacchus. Public drunkenness was increasingly frowned upon, but the act of drinking, especially in the Eucharist, retained sacred weight. Alcohol, now restrained by new moral codes, had not vanished but mutated. Even Islamic rule, which formerly forbade alcohol, did not erase its presence. In the Abbasid Caliphate, poets like Abu Nuwas composed lush odes to wine in open defiance of orthodoxy. Court physicians still debated the medical uses of fermented drinks, and wine continued to flow in elite circles behind closed doors. The contradiction was never entirely resolved. Alcohol was both illicit and immoral. In China, the legacy of alcohol took a different path. The Tang dynasty codified drinking rituals in the court, and among the literati, poets like Li Bai became synonymous with wine-soaked inspiration. Alcohol was not just tolerated, it was woven into the intellectual identity of the age. A drunken scholar was not a failure, but a visionary, dancing between clarity and chaos. Yet even in China, periods of temperance surfaced. Certain emperors attempted to restrict the production or sale of strong drink, citing disorder and wasted grain. But just as in Rome, just as in Babylon, these efforts almost always failed. Local distillers found workarounds. Farmers fermented quietly in jars buried beneath floorboards. And so the cycle continued. Control, resistance, adaptation. By the 9th and 10th centuries, European monasteries began to refine alcohol production with new seriousness. Benedictine monks measured grain ratios, logged fermentation times, and even experimented with filtering and bottling techniques. In this calm, ritualized environment, beer and wine regained some of their ancient roles: sustenance, medicine, reward. A monk might receive an extra ration on his feast day. A sick novice might be prescribed weak ale to soothe his gut. Within those stone walls, a tradition both ancient and enduring took new root, and it would be these same monasteries that passed fermentation knowledge into the high medieval world, laying the foundation for what would eventually become the great breweries and vineyards of early modern Europe. Yet despite these shifts, alcohol never quite returned to its ancient place. The sacrificial drinking of Bronze Age priests, the symposia of classical Athens, the imperial wine quotas of Persepolis all gave way to more personal, private, and eventually commercial uses. Alcohol became less sacred and more social. It grew from a public act to a private one, from a measure of your political or religious identity to a matter of taste, preference, habit. By the dawn of the second millennium, taverns had reappeared and offered wine to travelers, and cities like Paris and London taxed alcohol not as a divine commodity, but as a revenue stream. Even as brewing improved and trade widened, the reverence faded. Wine became a drink, beer a beverage, meat a curiosity. They still mattered, but they no longer held the weight of empires. And yet, in the background, something persisted: the shape of the cup, the old rituals, the feeling, the drinking. Together meant something more than calories consumed. The lingering idea that alcohol connected the living with something else: memory, laughter, courage, the dead. In many places, old libation practices never fully died. African griots still pour the first sip to the ancestors. Indian shamans offer fermented chicha to the mountains. Orthodox Christians sip sacramental wine and speak of transubstantiation. Each drink still carries traces of older meanings. So you raise your final cup clay, pewter, horn, or glass and drink to the persistence of fermentation, not the intoxication, but the human instinct to coax sweetness from grain, to store a harvest not only in jars but in time itself. Alcohol in the ancient world was not just a drink, it was a contract, a memory, a whisper between the living and the invisible, and perhaps it still is. But that leaves one last question quietly echoing through the clay jars and broken amphorae of long-dead taverns. If we have forgotten what our ancestors drank for, what exactly do we drink to now? Pets in ancient civilizations, you wake with the first light of morning slanting through a narrow window, the air dry and faintly sweet with the smell of old reeds and warm limestone. A small gray cat sits at your feet, purring softly, as if it has always belonged there. You are in a house near the Nile, around 1400 BCE, in Thebes. The cat is not a stray. It is sleek, well-fed, and wears a necklace of beads and tiny bronze amulets. Someone, perhaps you, has rubbed its ears, fed it scraps of fish, and watched as it chased moths through papyrus blinds. This cat is not merely tolerated. It is protected, pampered, and, in a certain way, holy. In ancient Egypt, animals were more than tools or symbols. They were companions, protectors, sometimes even family. The line between pet and sacred animal was soft, blurred by affection, ritual, and the sheer ordinariness of cohabiting life. Cats, in particular, held a special status. They guarded grain from mice, yes, but they were also associated with the goddess Bastet, bringer of home, fertility, and soft joy. Killing a cat even accidentally could provoke a riot. When a beloved house cat died, families often shaved their eyebrows as a sign of mourning. In some cases, cats were buried with their owners, mummified with care, wrapped in linen, and tucked beside familiar bones and tokens of comfort. Yet cats were not the only creatures to live inside the Egyptian home. In paintings, you see small monkeys tethered to chairs or peering over the shoulders of scribes. Ducks and geese were sometimes kept not for food but for companionship or ritual. Even gazelles, caught young and hand-fed, might be raised as pets. Their delicate forms visible in tomb art alongside children and servants. These animals were not merely exotic novelties for the elite, they existed across classes. Though the wealthier the household, the more elaborate the care. Pets appeared in love poetry and religious hymns, in household inventories and burial gifts. They were given names. Some were addressed like children. Others were honored with tomb stelae. The presence of pets reminds us that ancient households were not just human spaces, they were shared, shaped by the presence of animals who ate, slept, played, and sometimes died among their people. Far to the east, along the slow curves of the Yellow River in ancient China, you might find a different household, a different rhythm but familiar sounds. The chuffing bark of a small dog at the threshold, the fluttering wings of a songbird in a bamboo cage. In Shang Dynasty tombs, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of dogs buried beside their human owners, not as sacrifices, but in curled, peaceful poses suggesting a life lived together. In later periods, small breeds of lapdogs became common. In wealthier households, sometimes carried in sleeves or sat beside the family stove, especially prized for their companionship and warmth. Unlike the hunting or guard dogs of earlier generations, these animals existed purely as pets. They had no official function, no farm duty. They were simply there to be stroked, talked to, laughed at, and that simplicity may be what made them precious. Ancient Chinese texts include poems and proverbs referencing the joys of animal companionship, and training manuals advise gentle tones and predictable schedules for happier, more docile pets. Even fish kept in porcelain vessels or small ponds were appreciated not just as food, but as beautiful, calming presences. To watch their movements was to calm the spirit. It was a small luxury, yes, but a profound one. Across the Aegean Sea, the ancient Greeks were not immune to the charms of domestic animals. In the courtyards of Athens, one might find partridges or quail kept in low-walled cages for song, entertainment, or light company. Dogs were common, especially the Malachian hound, used both for guarding and hunting, but there are also references in Athenian literature to smaller, less utilitarian breeds. Socrates himself is recorded as comparing the loyalty of dogs to the wavering character of men. Children might keep rabbits or hares as pets, while wealthy citizens sometimes boasted of tamed birds. Trained to mimic speech, the philosopher Plutarch tells of pet crows who followed their owners through town squares, speaking simple phrases to the amusement or irritation of passersby. Yet Greek attitudes toward pets were layered. They admired the animal for its loyalty, its aesthetic charm, but also often maintained a boundary. These were still animals, and their place was alongside the household, not quite inside the human world. Still, when a pet died, it was not unusual for a family to mark the event. Short inscriptions on funerary stones commemorate dogs with names like Fido, Sweet Nose, and Blackie, sometimes written in childish handwriting, as if the grieving owner had been very young indeed. Died in Rome, the relationship between Humans and animals deepen further. Roman mosaics often depict lapdogs curled beside couches, their tiny paws resting on luxurious textiles. The wealthy kept monkeys, peacocks, and exotic birds imported from the empire's farthest edges, while even ordinary households might keep cats or small dogs for affection and pest control. Dogs especially were beloved. The Roman poet Martial wrote an epitaph for a tiny female dog named Issa, claiming she was smarter than many humans and slept in her mistress's bed, wrapped in a blanket like a child. In Pompeii, one mosaic famously reads Cave Canem, "Beware of the dog beneath," the image of a watchful hound, suggesting not just utility, but pride. That a household had a dog was something worth displaying. Pet ownership was both deeply personal and performative. Roman families gave pets names, celebrated their traits, mourned their deaths. They were, in essence, members of the household. And while some Romans still saw animals in terms of dominance or control, using exotic pets as status symbols, others truly bonded with them, writing elegies and placing their remains with care beneath garden tiles or in sealed urns. Further east, in the dense cities of Mesopotamia, evidence of pets is thinner but still present. Clay tablets record names for dogs, training instructions, and omens related to animal behavior. Dogs were both helpers and harbingers. If a dog followed someone into the street, it was considered a sign of bad luck or even divine displeasure. Yet these same dogs often lived among people, slept in courtyards, and appeared in family scenes carved into cylinder seals. In some texts, animals are described as messengers to the gods. A dog's howl might foretell a death. A bird's song might be an omen. This closeness, spiritual and physical, suggests a world in which animals were part of daily interpretation, comfort, and companionship, even if the word pet as we understand it didn't fully exist. Ownership, in our modern sense, was less important than proximity. The animals that mattered were the ones who stayed near, who ate from your hand, who watched your house across the world. Different civilizations define their relationship with animals in unique ways, but always alongside the monumental histories of war, trade, and conquest. There is this quieter story of children whispering to cats, of widows stroking dogs by the fire, of travelers returning home to find a familiar creature waiting. These small, everyday relationships rarely appear in grand historical records. They are found instead in murals, engraved goods, in letters and offhand remarks. And yet they shape people's lives. A pet, then as now, was often the first creature one spoke to in the morning and the last one seen at night. It was a bridge between the wild and the human, the sacred and the domestic. But if so many of these creatures lived and died with their people, loved and grieved for, pampered and remembered, then why do we find so few of their stories recorded in full? Why were the quiet companions left out of the scrolls and tablets that claim to capture life in full? You are walking slowly along the sun-baked stones of a necropolis outside Memphis, Egypt, around 650 BCE. But this isn't just a place for human burial. A long corridor lined with niches extends into the rocky catacomb of cats. Their tiny mummified forms are wrapped carefully in linen, some with painted masks, others adorned with beads, their paws tucked neatly beneath them. You pass thousands of them, stacked row after row, their presence both tender and haunting. These animals, you realize, were not all sacred temple cats. Some were beloved pets. Others were bred specifically for religious offerings to baste it. But each one represents a human choice to preserve, to memorialize, to transform affection into ritual. Nearby, dog cemeteries tell similar stories. Some tombs include small stelae with the dog's name and a short phrase of remembrance. A few inscriptions seem to speak in the owner's voice, addressing the pet directly. There is no practical reason for this. It is grief, plain and ancient, the kind that transcends rank or language. And it appears wherever people and animals lived in proximity, not just in tombs, but in walls, in letters, and the scratches left on clay bowls once used to serve food to a favorite creature. You find yourself next in the highlands of Anatolia, near the city of Hattusa, where the Hittite Empire once ruled with a complex legal code and an eye toward both order and superstition. Among their preserved laws etched in cuneiform is one regulating the theft or mistreatment of dogs. Fines are specified, injuries are categorized. Even the compensation for a noblewoman's lost dog is outlined. These are not abstract animals, they are named, recognized as having owners, sometimes even legal protections. Some were guard dogs, some were herders, and some, likely the smaller, less practical ones, were simply kept close. In ritual texts, dogs are invoked as witnesses to oaths, present at sacred boundaries, or participants in purification rites. They were seen as loyal, protective, and liminal creatures that walked between the human and the spiritual, not quite domestic, not quite wild, but close enough to be loved. In early India, the Vedic texts don't often dwell on household pets, but archaeological sites reveal dog bones buried intentionally alongside humans, suggesting a closeness not always recorded in scripture. Later Hindu traditions offer a more visible affection toward animals, including monkeys, cows, and birds, many of which also appear in household settings. In rural regions, monkeys were fed by hand, not only as sacred beings but as familiar presences. Parrots and mynas were kept in cages to mimic speech and bring amusement to family life. These animals show up in folktales and epics, not as warriors or gods, but as clever companions. Their voices, however imperfect, were a source of joy. Naming an animal gave it personhood. Losing it brought silence. The Romans ever detailed in their recording of domestic life went even further. Beyond mosaics and statuary, we find extensive literary references to named pets. A lapdog named Margarita Pearl is mentioned in an inscription from a child's grave. Another epitaph reads, "To Helena, the dancing dog, who knew every trick, who delighted all who saw her." These aren't mere animals, they're remembered with the same specificity as human friends, and often their deaths are noted in letters, household accounts, even wills. A Roman matron might leave a small sum for the continued care of a pet, or request that it be buried in a family plot. There were laws against cruelty, not broad ones, but specific enough to note that public abuse of a household pet could bring disgrace. Children were taught to be gentle with animals, in part as a moral lesson. How one treated a pet reflected one's capacity for patience, restraint, and affection. In Greece, pet funerals were rare, but not unknown. When they happened, they were usually quiet affairs. A few words, a favorite blanket, a small stone marker. But their presence in art and poetry was constant. Theocritus wrote tenderly of a shepherd's lost puppy. Aristotle remarked on the intelligence of dogs with something like admiration. Pets were not just household adornments. They were subjects of study, observation, even philosophy. Plato once described the loyalty of a dog as the highest form of virtue that could be found in a non-human being. There were still boundaries. Few pets slept in beds, and only rarely were they allowed inside temples, but their emotional presence was undeniable. In Persia, small dogs appear on textiles and painted tiles. Royal palaces likely kept exotic animals, but among common people, simpler bonds existed. A clay figurine of a mother holding a small child and a pup has been found in a modest home, likely not as a toy, but as a domestic scene frozen in memory. You can imagine that household: the bread baking, the child playing, the dog waiting patiently underfoot. It is a scene that could belong to almost any era. In Babylon, fragmentary letters mention sending a puppy as a gift to a cousin. In Assyria, the king's gardens contain not only rare trees and flowers but cages for birds and monkeys, brought from distant lands and tended by foreign keepers. The fascination with animals stretched beyond the practical. It was aesthetic, symbolic, affectionate, and sometimes it was deeply personal. But not all ancient views of animals were gentle. Some pets were abandoned when they became sick or old. Others were kept chained or confined. Bred solely for appearance or amusement, cruelty existed and so did indifference in large cities. Feral dogs roamed in packs, feared more than loved. In certain rituals, animals were killed as offerings, even if they had once been kept near. The same cultures that buried pets with tenderness could also sacrifice them with ceremony. This tension, the dual role of animal as companion and as commodity, ran through every civilization. Yet even amid that ambiguity, the individual bond between human and pet persisted. In quiet corners of tombs, in lines of poetry, in the soft indentation of a curled dog's body beside its owner, we find evidence of a tenderness that defied politics and theology. You return to that first cat in Egypt, purring beside the loom, or the lapdog curled beneath a Roman's cloak, and wonder about the voice that called its name. Did they speak to it the way we do, softly, half laughing, as if the animal could understand? Did they wake to its absence with the same quiet ache? Or did they grieve and move on, comforted by the knowledge that in their short lives, these creatures were not forgotten, but honored in small but meaningful ways? And if so many pets were mourned with such care, wrapped in linen, painted, named, remember, then why does ancient history so rarely speak directly in their voice? You find yourself in a cold stone room of a medieval monastery, somewhere in the Alps. A monk writes by candlelight, his quill scratching the parchment with deliberate care. Near his feet, a small dog snores softly, curled in the folds of a worn wool robe. It is the 8th century CE, and outside, the world is unstable plagues, warbands, trade disruptions. But in here, the rhythm is steady: prayer, labor, silence. And even in this cloistered world, the need for quiet companionship persists. The monks do not write about the dog. Its name is not preserved, but its presence there by the fire, waiting at the cloister gate, is not unusual. Across the remnants of fallen civilizations, as new societies rise on old stones, pets quietly endure. They may be unnamed in the annals, but they are everywhere in the margins. Small dogs are painted into the corners of illuminated manuscripts. Cats appear in marginalia, chasing mice between lines of scripture. It is easy to overlook them. They are not grand. They do not speak of conquest, but they speak of comfort, of continuity, of a world that even in its most chaotic still had room for something small and beloved. As Christianity spread through Europe, the symbolism of animals changed. Some were associated with sin or temptation. Others were elevated into saint stories and legends. Saint Jerome was often depicted with a lion at his feet, not as a symbol of dominion, but of peaceful companionship. In Celtic Christianity, animals played a larger role. Stories tell of monks who befriended otters, birds, or foxes, creatures drawn not by force but by trust. These were not pets in the modern sense, but they were bonded. They came, stayed, and were remembered. In the East, within the Byzantine Empire, cats were valued for their role in protecting manuscript collections from rats, often allowed to live inside scriptoriums. Some monasteries even kept breeding populations of cats specifically for that purpose. Dogs, too, were tolerated, sometimes even welcomed despite scriptural ambiguities. They guarded, accompanied, listened, and in this quiet companionship, the ancient impulse lived on. Meanwhile, beyond the borders of these empires, in the indigenous cultures of the Americas, we find echoes of similar bonds. In Mesoamerica, the hairless Zoroastrian dog was more than a pet. It was a guide for the dead, believed to escort souls across the river to the afterlife. Families often buried their Zolo with them, ensuring safe passage. But even among those not ritually interred, there is evidence of affection. In household ruins, we find bowls with dog-sized bite marks or paw prints left in drying clay. In the Andes, the Inca kept small birds, alpacas, and guinea pigs not only for food or ritual, but sometimes for companionship. Children likely played with them Elders likely smiled when they approached. These connections did not need monuments, they were embedded in daily life. The quiet ritual of feeding, the warmth of a sleeping animal at your feet, these were acts of love. Even if no historian wrote them down. In Japan, by the Heian period circa 800 to 1200 CE, aristocrats began keeping lapdogs and birds not merely for function, but for pleasure. In the Pillow Book by Sei Shinagan, a court lady writes with open affection about her dog's antics. She names him, scolds him, praises his charm. It's one of the earliest surviving personal accounts of a named pet in East Asia, and it feels startlingly modern. She speaks of him not as a possession, but as a creature with moods, with personality. Her words echo those written to millennia earlier in Rome, and likely felt by people whose names we will never know. In every age, someone, somewhere spoke softly to a pet, perhaps unaware that this small ritual was part of a human tradition older than the pyramids. So as you settle down on your mat, watching twilight settle over tiled roofs and clay chimneys, you notice your host placing a small carved charm near the doorway, muttering something you don't quite catch. You want to ask, what does it mean? Why do they do it? But perhaps that's not the point. Perhaps they don't know exactly either. It's just something their grandmother did, and her grandmother before her. Something that seemed to help, or at least didn't hurt. And if so many ancient people performed these quiet rituals for centuries, what does that say about the boundary between reason and fear? What did they know or believe they were really protecting themselves from? You wake on a slope, hillside, in the countryside of ancient Anatolia, where the morning dew still clings to the threshold stones of a modest dwelling. A clay tablet rests on a shelf nearby, etched not with taxes or poetry, but with a list of signs, omens, they call them. If a snake enters through the left doorpost, good fortune will follow. If the same snake curls to sleep near the hearth, misfortune may strike within 3 days. You don't ask why. You just sweep the hearth before sunset and place a shard of broken pottery beneath your pillow to catch bad dreams. The world around you is too fragile, too unstable to challenge such things directly. These aren't casual habits, they are survival tools, handed down not through logic, but lineage. Even in great empires like the Hittites or the Assyrians, where kings boasted of conquests in stone and bronze, there were specialists trained not only in war, but in the reading of signs. Diviners studied liver models, inspected bird entrails, watched the shape of smoke rising from altars. Whole armies paused based on the twist of a sheep's liver or the croak of a toad. In the wrong direction, the emperor might consult generals but also stargazers. Before a treaty was signed, before a city wall was built, someone, somewhere, always asked the unseen world for permission, because to act without signs was to court disaster, and the gods, silent as they were, could punish oversight with remarkable creativity. Further west, in the mountain towns of Etruria, people carved small, folded hands from ivory and bronze, hands making protective gestures, hands with clenched fingers, or extended thumbs tucked between two others. These amulets, called manu, were tucked into children's clothing, hung from wagons, hidden inside thresholds. They were crude, sometimes even obscene in design, but their meaning was protective, to repel envy, to keep misfortune away. The Etruscans, red lightning strikes the way we might read a newspaper headline. They divided the sky into sacred quadrants and tracked where thunder first echoed. If the first bolt came from the northeast, a warning. From the south, a blessing. Their city plans, even cemeteries, followed cosmological alignments because you could not simply live, you had to live in harmony with the world's invisible. Great years later, when the Romans adopted these practices, they refined them into systems. Whole colleges of augurs and haruspices operated across the empire. They wore curved staffs and traced invisible boundaries in the air. Before deciding where a town gate should be built or when a senator should begin a journey, no action existed outside the web of ritual timing. Even marriages and adoptions were scheduled after consultations with signs. It wasn't just ceremony, it was protection through precision. But superstitions weren't always about grand public decisions. More often, they lived in kitchens, doorways, and quiet corners. In early Jewish households, for example, a small parchment inscribed with scripture was placed in a box and nailed to the doorframe. This mezuzah served as both a commandment and a ward, a signal that the home was marked and watched over. In Zoroastrian homes, sacred fires were kept burning to ward off evil spirits that fed on darkness and decay. In early Vedic India, before any sacred ritual, a line of turmeric might be drawn around the space, a fragrant boundary against interference. Children were smeared with charcoal or soot beneath their eyes to confuse jealous spirits or evil looks. These weren't signs of faith alone, they were reflexes, as natural as pulling a child close during a storm, as ordinary as leaving a light burning for a traveler who may never come. These gestures, repeated over centuries, became architecture. They became culture. And in time, no one asked if they worked. They were done because not doing them left one exposed. Exposed to misfortune, to whispers, to the lingering fear that some invisible rule had been broken. And then there were the places you simply didn't go. In nearly every ancient city, certain alleys, wells, groves, or ruins were avoided without explanation. Perhaps someone once drowned there. Perhaps an old woman lived nearby who muttered too much. But even without proof, children crossed the street to avoid it, and parents warned them with a glance, not a speech. These were shadow spaces where rules thin, where the known met the strange. In Athens, a fig tree might be tied with red thread to keep witches away. In Carthage, salt might be buried under the doorstep to block the entry of ghosts. In Persia, nail clippings and hair were burned or buried far from the home, never discarded, casually, as they might be used in magic. And in ancient Japan, the direction you slept mattered. Facing north was unlucky, facing west, unlucky too. East or south only, especially for the elderly or pregnant. Did these beliefs always come from religion? Sometimes, but often they came from older sources before codified gods and formal temples. They came from weather, from repetition, from grief passed down through generations until it took shape as a rule. Even tools and trades had their superstitions. Blacksmiths, who worked with fire and iron, were often both respected and feared. Their hammers were said to drive away spirits. Their forges, even when silent, were never to be sat upon lest one's fertility be stolen. In the fishing villages along the Phoenician coast, sailors refused to utter the names of drowned men before voyages, believing the sea might hear and take more. Cooks avoided dropping knives at midday. Market vendors marked their scales with oil before each use to avoid deception. Even the humblest job came with its own miniature rituals, because mistakes weren't always seen as human error. They could be interpreted as breaches in the unseen contract between humans and the mysterious forces that move beneath the surface of life. So now, as you walk along a dusty road lined with milestone markers and crumbled altars, you feel the weight of centuries of gestures, crossed fingers, knocked wood, salt thrown over the shoulder. They didn't appear all at once. They formed from repetition, memory, accidents, and patterns misread until they became patterns believed. And even now, long after the temples have collapsed and the oracles have gone silent, you see people hesitate before stepping on a threshold, crack or touching a statue's nose for luck. They may not remember where the ritual came from, but they do it anyway. And maybe that's the strangest superstition of all, the one that continues not because it is understood, but because the habit feels safer than silence. But if people across all these ancient civilizations, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, performed the same kinds of rituals for protection, does that mean their fears were all the same? Or were they simply trying, in their own quiet ways, to make meaning out of chaos? You are standing beneath the stone arches of a Roman bridge, moss pushing up between the cracks. The the river slow and brown below. Overhead, carved into the keystone, is a faint inscription and offering to river spirits, written by a stonemason long dead. It's not a formal dedication, just a name, a plea, in the shape of a bird. Perhaps it was scratched there in fear that the bridge would collapse or that someone would drown before its completion. It's barely visible now, but it's still there, like hundreds of other small gestures across the ancient world scratched into clay, tied into knots, whispered under breath. These were the things that didn't make it into history books, but built the rhythm of ancient life more reliably than battles or laws ever could. You think about how much effort went into making the world feel safe, how entire societies, from the simplest farmers to emperors, lived with a sense that the world was watching them, not always cruelly, but attentively. A cracked mirror wasn't just an accident. A child born under a red moon wasn't just coincidence. People didn't need proof. They had stories. The man who ignored the dream of the black horse and lost his vineyard. The woman who forgot to toss salt before travel and never came home. These stories didn't need to be true. They needed to be remembered. Superstition, then, was not failure of thought. It was a kind of inherited logic. A logic passed not by fact, but by survival. And those who kept to the rituals, no matter how strange, were often those who made it through storms and illness and famine. Even if the rituals had nothing to do with the outcome, the belief that they did was enough to try again. There is something haunting in that, and something deeply human. You begin to notice how superstition didn't just survive alongside religion, it often outlived it. As empires fell and gods were replaced or renamed, the little habits remained. You can trace them across time like footprints in wet soil. The black cat who crosses the road in medieval France is not so different from the temple cat of Bubastis, Egypt. The sailor tying a charm to his mast in 17th century Portugal is not unlike the Phoenician merchant who buried a coin under the keel of his ship before launching. Even in the Christian world, where formal doctrine often denounced pagan practices, the rituals persisted, sometimes disguised as folk customs, sometimes just too quiet to be noticed. A woman might cross herself before entering a new home, then also spit lightly on the ground for good luck, she might say. No one asks which part came from faith and which from fear. They were both part of being safe. Monks in Ireland left coins under ancient trees to prevent mischief. Villagers in northern Italy tied red string around infants' wrists against the evil eye. In Jewish ghettos, old women poured water after departing guests to ensure they'd return safely. These weren't public declarations. They were small acts of resistance against randomness, against cruelty, against not knowing. The Enlightenment came, of course, with its rational eyes and its disdain for anything that could not be proved. But even as people began to calculate planets and map diseases, many still touched iron, avoided walking under ladders, or feared the 13th step. Science did not erase superstition, it simply pushed it further into the private spaces of thought. A physicist might not believe in curses, but still hesitate when a mirror breaks. A doctor might dismiss herbal charms, but still feel unease when hearing a strange bird cry at night. What began in the ancient world as shared, public ritual gradually became personal, even secret, and yet it is no less persistent. A wedding today may still include old sayings, something old, something new, and few ask why. A child still makes a wish on a fallen eyelash. A person alone on a dark night may find themselves wishing, not to pass the time, but to ward something off, though they couldn't say what. It's not that we believe, it's that we remember believing, and somewhere in that memory lies comfort. Even now, in a world of algorithms and satellites, you'll find people hanging charms in their cars, placing coins in fountains, or refusing to name certain things aloud when illness is near. You might think it's culture, habit, or just a joke, but beneath that, there's something older. Something that hasn't changed since the first person threw a stone behind them, just in case. Superstition may not be rational, but it is consistent. It is the human attempt to speak back to a world that does not always explain itself, to create, cause where there is only effect. And though we dress it differently now with horoscope apps and algorithmic personality tests, or with plastic bracelets meant to balance our energy, the need remains. The need to feel connected to something beyond logic, to feel protected, even when alone, to feel that our smallest choices can shape an outcome we do not fully control. So you wonder, looking back through time at scratched inscriptions, buried charms, whispered warnings, were the ancients really so different from us? Or were they simply more honest about the quiet fear that lingers at the edge of every unknown moment? And if they were, is it possible that their superstitions weren't just empty rituals, but a kind of truth they couldn't name? What kept ancient women busy all day? You open your eyes before the sun has finished rising, in a narrow home made of mud brick and thatch, somewhere near the edge of an ancient village, maybe Thebes, maybe maybe somewhere now unmarked by modern maps. The floor beneath you is hard-packed earth, still cool from the night. There is no clock, no rooster, your body just knows. Someone must fetch water before the road fills with carts and sandals and feet. You rise quietly, wrapping your head covering to keep dust out of your hair, and lift a clay jar already chipped from years of careful use. You are not a priestess or queen, not a figure in a myth. You are simply one of many, an ordinary woman born into a rhythm that began long before you and will continue after. The tasks today are not new. You could do them blindfolded, one-handed, in the dark hand some days. You nearly do. The bread needs to be started before anything else. You grind the grain with a stone against another stone, and a rhythm that hums. In your bones, grain dust settles into the cracks of your skin. The sound is dry, gritty, slow. This might take an hour or two. It depends on the flour, the weather, your mood. But it must be done. The dough must rise. And while it does, the fire must be coaxed to life. You blow on embers, feed them with twigs, whisper a small word to whatever spirit or god still lives in the smoke. You do not know if it matters, but you say it anyway. It's what your mother did. While the fire burns low and steady, your hands begin their second duty, spinning thread, rope, yarn, whatever's needed. The spindle twirls between your fingers as you rock slightly, balancing the movement with your breath. You've done this so many times you don't remember learning. It came with the air, like dust. Around you, the house slowly stirs. A child coughs. Someone steps over your bowl without looking. The smell of yesterday's fire still clings to the thatch above. Someone complains about the cold. You do not answer. The thread must be kept even. Spinning may seem dull, but it is not meaningless. Every robe worn, every net cast, every offering cloth at the temple, someone made it, and often that someone was a woman like you, hunched in the corner, listening to stories she'd heard before while twisting fibers into thread. If you are lucky, the baby stays asleep. If not, you shift tasks. The baby's needs override all else: feeding, cleaning, wrapping in strips of cloth to keep their limbs straight and safe. There's no concept of multitasking, only doing what must be done. The pot needs checking. The fire needs more wood. A neighbor stops by to ask about a missing goat, or to gossip about someone's daughter who wore red on the wrong day. You nod politely, answer briefly. Time is short, and the list is long. Later, there will be oil to press, lentils to sort, water to draw again, and perhaps, if someone is ill, a mixture to be ground with honey and bitter herbs. You may not call yourself a healer, but you know what your grandmother taught. You know what to do for a sore tooth, a fever, a bad dream died at midday. The sun climbs high, and the walls trap the heat like a kiln. You retreat to the shade, not to rest, but to weave. The loom is simple, a frame of sticks, but the skill it requires is not. Patterns must be counted, mistakes undone slowly. This fabric might be a gift, or part of a dowry, or something to trade for sesame. Either way, it must be perfect. You hum while you work, not because you're happy, but because silence makes the day stretch longer around you. Other women work too. Sometimes there is laughter, sometimes not. Conversation comes in fragments, as do stories half-remembered tales of gods and ghosts, of ancestors and floods, of women who once lived differently. In houses of stone or in cities by the sea, no one really believes them, but everyone listens. As the day slips into late afternoon, the shadows stretch long across the floor. There is still sweeping to do, grain to store, a broken clay bowl to be patched with pitch. You might help with the animals. You might wash someone's hair. You might sharpen a knife. But none of it will be recorded. No scribe will etch your name into a tablet. No child in a future century will learn your story. And yet without you, the food would not be made, the linen not spun, the fire not lit. Without you, the city would stop not all at once, but slowly, like a wheel running out of turn. As the sun begins to sink, you wash your hands with coarse sand and rinse with the day's last precious water. The bread is cooled. A child sleeps again. The loom is folded. The jar is empty. You sit on the worn stone outside your door, watching the sky shift colors in silence. You wonder, as your grandmother did, and hers before her will tomorrow be like today, and the day after? Or will something change? But there is no answer, only the sounds of night animals waking and a breeze stirring the dust. What did women like you dream of in the ancient world? When the day's work was finally done, you wake again, but this time the ceiling above you is painted faded flowers curling toward a cracked plaster edge, the mark of a family that once had some wealth. You are in a Roman household now, not a grand villa, but a respectable domus in the middle of Pompeii, where ash has not yet fallen and the kitchen still smells faintly of olive oil. And yesterday is lentil mash. You are a woman, but your role depends on your status, which is as fixed and invisible as the wind. If you are the matron, you must oversee the household, instruct the slaves, ensure the family's honor remains intact by staying largely invisible outside the home. Your day is quieter than a servant's, but no less watched. There are linens to inspect, storerooms to check, a husband's tunic to clean before the forum. Perhaps you rise early to supervise the baking, to count the grain supply, to arrange for your daughter's dowry chest, or perhaps, if your family owns several slaves, you do none of this directly, but you still must know how it's done. Your authority rests on managing others' labor, and your reputation can rise or fall on the freshness of the bread and the cleanliness of the atrium. But if you are not the matron, if you are one of the enslaved women, your tasks begin long before sunrise. You might work the laundry, pounding and scrubbing garments in a cold stone basin until your hands bleed, or serve as wet nurse, nursemaid, cook, grinder, cleaner, bath attendant, chamber pot collector. The masters may not see you, but they depend on you completely. And when the child falls sick, it is you they wait. When the husband is late, it is you who waits by the door. The word for labor and suffering are closely related in Latin. You live them both, are by our dot further east, in Han China. The story changes, but the rhythm does not. The day begins not with fire, but with brushwork women rising to tend silkworms, checking their leaves, sweeping their trays, listening for the nearly inaudible click of their chewing. Silk is a woman's realm, and the entire economy leans on it. You live in a compound with your husband's family, and your duties multiply depending on who is watching. Your mother-in-law may ask for tea. Your sister-in-law may need help dyeing cloth. You never speak loudly. You do not walk through the central courtyard unless required. Quiet efficiency is prized. You wrap your hair, light incense, grind soybeans into paste, and teach your daughter to sweep correctly, not missing the corners where bad spirits might settle. If your husband is kind, your work is constant but endurable. If he is cruel, your work is the same, just heavier with fear. But the labor remains: weaving, patching, warming soup, preparing ancestral offerings, sewing sachets of herbs to place under sleeping mats. You might also be trained to read a little, to write poetry on scraps of silk if your family is wealthy. but always under the condition that it does not interfere with your duties. The ancestors must be honored. The rites must be rinsed 12 times. Your child's future depends not on your ambition, but your discipline. Across the sea, in ancient India, you might live in a home filled with the scent of ghee and turmeric, with rough cotton mats stretched out to dry. As a daughter, your hands learn early how to fold, press, and cook. You sweep not just for cleanliness, but as a gesture of respect to the goddess Lakshmi. Your mother shows you how to smear cow dung in front of the door, part disinfectant, part sacred ritual. If your family follows Vedic traditions, you recite prayers while washing. If they are more folk-oriented, you may learn different chants, protective gestures, ways to ward off jealousy or attract rain. You are told from a young age to avoid the well during your bleeding days, to touch nothing sacred. But even then, the work does not stop. You wash separately. You sit alone, but you still must prepare meals. Watch younger siblings spin thread. You are told these things matter, that women hold the family's purity, that their obedience keeps the household in balance. You might never leave your house more than once a week, and still, your work stretches into every hour. Boiling milk just right, threading jasmine flowers into your sister's braid, kneading the dough until it no longer sticks to your palm. A holy man once said that a woman's labor, when done with stillness, is a form of prayer. You do not know if that is true, but you hope it means someone is watching, because no one else seems to be. And in Greece, particularly Athens, where freedom and thought were praised in the streets, you likely wouldn't even be there to hear it. A respectable woman remains. Inside, the public world belongs to men, so your hours are spent in the gyneconitis, the women's quarters. Your hands are always busy, twisting wool, making garments, preparing burial wreaths, baking barley cakes, and caring for children. If your husband is wealthy, your responsibilities grow administrative. You instruct enslaved women, maintain family accounts, prepare for festivals. You might slip into a religious procession once or twice a year, but otherwise your presence is symbolic, quiet, contained, necessary. You might envy the women of Sparta, who train, own property, and move freely, but their world feels distant and strange. You do not have time to compare. Each day's schedule fills quickly. Births and funerals must be prepared with ritual items, oil for the lamps, ashes for the hearth, offerings of cake and fig and wine. You might sing quietly while you work, something half remembered, something old. The song is not yours, but you hum it anyway, because it carries the day faster. And in the quiet lull of late afternoon, you sometimes wonder what it would be like to walk through the agora without a veil, to speak in your own voice, but you never say it aloud. All across the ancient world, the rhythms were the same: spinning, grinding, boiling, sewing, cleaning, lifting, feeding. These were not grand acts. They were invisible labors, to ordinary for records, to repetitive for poems, and yet, without them, the world would stop spinning. Women were not allowed to vote, roll, or declare wars, but they controlled something even more constant: the unseen machinery of daily life. And that machinery was delicate. If a spindle broke, if the oil ran out, if a child fell ill, everything faltered. That's why women taught each other, why instructions passed not in books, but in gestures. How long to boil lentils, when to bury an umbilical cord, which herbs to use when fever rises. These things were not written down because they were not considered important by the men who wrote, but the women remembered, and they passed it on. So when you imagine ancient history, its kings, temples, trees, and cities, do not forget the hands beneath it all. Do not forget the women who turned history's wheel with thread, smoke, sweat, and silence. But if this labor was constant across centuries, what changed for women when the empire around them collapsed, or when their work became too valuable to remain invisible? You are standing now on the edge of a road that was once part of a city. Any city, really. The stones beneath your feet, are still worn smooth by the same traffic of sandals, hooves, and wooden wheels that once rattled through the daily routines of ancient life. But this time, the air smells of smoke, the market is silent, the walls are crumbling. The city has fallen. Maybe it was war, or drought, or plague. Maybe the empire that fed it has collapsed. Its coinage useless, its gods forgotten. And in this moment, when men are fighting or fleeing, it is often women who are left behind to carry the pieces because the labor they once did quietly, invisibly, in kitchens and weaving rooms now becomes critical to survival. When the palace falls, someone still has to boil water. When the scribes vanish, someone still remembers the healing herbs. When a child asks what to do, someone still answers with knowledge not found in scrolls, but in repetition, scars, and memory. And often, it is women who preserve the shape of life after disaster. It happened in Rome when the Western Empire collapsed, not with a final, dramatic moment, but gradually, street by street, as families retreated into private spaces. Women continued to grind grain, teach children, tend gardens, and pass down fragments of culture through lullabies and household rituals long after temples closed and forums emptied. It happened in Mesopotamia when floods erased cities. Women knew how to carry seeds and start again. It happened in Egypt when new rulers came with new gods. But women still made bread the old way, still whispered the names of older deities under their breath, even when laws changed and languages shifted. The hands of women preserved continuity not through politics, but through habits, and sometimes their labor didn't just survive collapse, it reshaped power. In ancient Sparta, women held remarkable autonomy not because of philosophy, but because so many men died in training or war that women inherited land, controlled estates, and oversaw trade. In Rome, wealthy women began funding public buildings, temples, and baths not in their husbands' names, but their own. Their wealth came from inheritance, their power from patience. And when plagues wiped out populations, as they did again and again, it was often the local wise women, not priests, who knew what herbs eased fever, what foods the sick could still swallow. Their work, long dismissed as domestic or incidental, became the foundation for survival, yet their names still went unwritten. We know them through what they left behind: dye stains on the floor, spindle whorls buried in graves, fragments of recipes scratched into potsherds. It's not that they were forgotten because they didn't matter. They were forgotten because they never stopped long enough to tell their own stories. Their hands were always busy. Their mouths were full of instructions, their heads filled with lists.
And still, some women broke through the silence, if only briefly. A Sumerian high priestess named Inhejuana wrote poetry so powerful it was preserved on clay for centuries, writing of war, love, moonlight, and grief. A Roman midwife named Scribonia Largus was cited in medical texts for her remedies. Ban Zhao, a scholar in Han China, advised the imperial court and wrote books on women's education and ethics that shaped dynasties. These women were rare, yes, but they emerged from the same homes, the same long days, the same quiet labor that shaped the lives of so many others. Their stories were unusual only because someone finally wrote them down. Most women, whether slaves, farmers, merchants' wives, or temple attendants, never had that chance. But their work shaped the world just as surely as any general's campaign or emperor's decree. They cooked food that sustained armies. They raised children who became rulers. They wove the sails that carried trade across oceans, and always, they did so under the weight of expectation, to be invisible, diligent, obedient, and unrecorded now. Centuries later, their names may be lost, but their rhythms live in the quiet acts that still structure daily life. The folding of linen, the lighting of a stove, the plaiting of a child's hair. the instinct to prepare for tomorrow even before today is finished. You may never know what it was like to walk barefoot over packed earth while balancing a clay jar on your head. But you can understand the repetition, the sacrifice, the small pride in doing something well, even if no one thanks you. You may even feel the echo of those lives in your own, the things you do not for applause, but because someone must do them. The things that, while forgotten by history, are never forgotten by those who depend on them. And so you wonder, quietly, if someone, thousands of years from now, were to study your life, would they understand the value of your small routines? Would they see how everything you did built the day for someone else? Or would they overlook it, as they overlooked hers? What personal hygiene was like in ancient times, before soap. You wake to the faint sound of braying animals, the low shuffle of feet outside, and the sharp, slightly sour scent of sweat soaked into yesterday's linen. It's morning in an ancient city, maybe Rome, maybe Babylon, or somewhere now unnamed on the edge of the desert tanned. Your body remembers what to do before your thoughts even gather. You stretch slowly, skin stiff from heat and dust, your mouth dry from sleeping close to a small, smoky fire. You don't reach for a bar of soap. There isn't one. Soap, if it exists in your world, is a coarse thing used mostly for laundry, boiled from fat and ash, stinking and harsh, not something you'd willingly rub across your skin. Instead, your idea of clean begins with water, always water, and your relationship to it is intimate, limited, and deeply practical. Water is not just a resource, it's a decision. How much can you use? Where did it come from? You fetch it in a ceramic jar or brass basin, still cool from the early morning air, and place it near the worn cloth that serves as your towel. You do not bathe in tubs, not every day. Baths, if they exist, are public or occasional. Today's cleansing will be something quicker, quieter, and pieced together from memory and habit. You pour a small amount over your hands, rub your palms until the grit softens, and splash water onto your face, cupped and careful rubbing gently around your eyes, under your jaw, into the hairline where yesterday's oil still lingers. You are not trying to feel fresh the way a modern person might. You are trying not to offend yourself, your neighbors, your gods. Hair comes next. You comb it slowly, fingers first, then with a rough-toothed implement carved from bone or wood. Oil helps here. Olive oil, if you're Roman, sesame or castor. If you're from the East, you warm a little between your palms, smoothing it through the strands, not just to tame them, but to lift away dust. The oil attracts grime so it can be scraped away. That's the secret. Cleanliness is not about bubbles. It's about friction, patience, and tools. If you are wealthier or live near a bathhouse, you might have access to a stridular curved bronze blade used to scrape skin after oiling. You coat your arms, legs, and chest, then drag the tools slowly down your limbs, catching the dust and old oil in thin, dark ribbons. You do this in long, practiced motions, feeling the tension ease from your muscles as the blade travels. If you're poor, you may use a reed or a piece of wood instead. It's not luxurious, it's ritual. Children are taught to scrape early. Even soldiers in the field carry their own stridules. To be covered in oil is not considered dirty. To not remove it properly, that is the problem. Your feet are next. They take the most damage, cracked, blistered, thick with dust. You soak them in a small basin if you can spare the water, then rub them with coarse sand, or sometimes a rough cloth dipped in vinegar. Vinegar is a luxury, but a versatile one. It stings, It cleans. It wards off the small infections that live in cuts and between toes. Teeth are harder to manage. No one brushes as you understand it, but many chew aromatic Styx licorice root. Myrrh or neem to freshen breath and scrub away residue. In Egypt, a woman might mix natron salt with crushed mint leaves and rub it along her gums. In India, charcoal is common, bitter and gritty, but effective. You do not smile wide often, so appearances matter less than comfort. Mouths are for eating, praying, and speaking carefully. Clean enough is good enough. There is also scent to consider. You cannot remove every odor, so you balance them. Perfumed oils are used in tiny amounts, rubbed behind the ears, under the arms, across the collarbone, not to mask, but to harmonize. You don't expect to smell like nothing. You expect to smell human with a hint of saffron or frankincense or myrtle. For women, scent becomes part of beauty. For men, part of honor. Too strong is suspicious. Too absent is rude. The balance is social, not medical. Deodorant, in the modern sense, does not exist. Instead, people use ash under the arms, or clay, or even powdered resin. In India, sandalwood paste serves double duty. It cools and reduces odor. In Greece, crushed rose petals might be dabbed into linen. You adjust according to season, status, and need. Your body is not private. It is part of the public world. People. Notice how you carry it. Cleanliness is not just comfort, it is respect. Latrines, if you have access to one, are communal. You do not flush. You squat, clean with water, cloth, or even a sponge tied to a stick. You rinse the sponge in vinegar between uses. If you're outside the city, you use the fields, and you do so carefully, facing a direction your culture deems correct, following unspoken rules about modesty and decency. Men and women have different spaces or different times, and afterward, you wash your hands, if you're fortunate, with running water from a fountain, but more often with a small bowl and a handful of sand or ash. Germs are not known, but cleanliness is linked to morality, ritual, and status. If you prepare food, touch sacred objects, or enter a temple, you must cleanse perhaps 3 times, perhaps with a prayer, perhaps in silence. By midday, you've sweated again. Your linen is damp under the arms. Dust clings to your forearms and settles into the crease of your neck. But this is expected. People don't expect permanence. They expect effort. And later, when the sun lowers and the work is done, you may cleanse again, gently, slowly, with water if it's still cool, with oil if it's all you have, with fingers that know exactly where to press, how to wipe, and how much is enough to feel like yourself again. You don't wash to feel new. You wash to return to comfort, to stillness, to a version of your body you recognize. And perhaps that's why, in a world without soap, people still found ways to feel clean. But if soap wasn't central to ancient hygiene, why did it finally become the thing we now cannot live without? Imagine, for a moment, standing in a temple courtyard in ancient Egypt. The air dry and almost silent except for the sound of someone pouring water over stone. You are not here to pray, not yet. First you must be made clean, not with scrubbing or lather, but with a quiet act of purification. In ancient Egypt, cleanliness was bound not to germs, but to sacred order, to Mat, the balance of the universe. Every morning, priests bathed in cold water from the Nile, often multiple times a day. They shaved every hair from their bodies not for vanity, but to prevent any impurity from offending the gods, they applied natron, a salty mineral that absorbed sweat and oil, and wore linens freshly laundered with ash and water. To approach a shrine with dust on your skin was not just impolite, was a spiritual hazard, but the same was expected of many commoners, too. Before eating, before rituals, before burial preparations, the body had to be in harmony with the gods, and harmony began with water and salt and patience. In contrast, in ancient India, bathing was not just religious, it was woven into the calendar. You might rise before dawn, walk to the river, and immerse yourself fully, feeling the pull of cold water against your ribs. Morning bathing was essential, especially before prayer or eating. The Ganges was holy, but so was any clean stream. Soap wasn't used. Instead, women rubbed their skin with turmeric paste, cleansing, cooling, mildly antiseptic. Men used clay or ash, scrubbed with rough mitts made from jute. Even now, Indian traditions remember the feel of this ancient ritual, not a spo-like indulgence, but a daily offering to balance body and soul. A woman might anoint her hair with coconut oil once a week, sitting in sunlight while a friend combed it out with wide wooden teeth. Hair was a serious matter. Oiled, braided, protected. Shaving the head was a mark of devotion or of mourning. Nails were trimmed with bits of sharpened metal. Ears were cleaned with twists of cloth. In some regions, women wore small sacks of aromatic herbs under their garments, not perfume, but scent for protection and modesty. Cleanliness was not about fragrance. It was about purity, about ritual correctness. Now step west to ancient Greece, where cleanliness was considered part of civilization itself. To be clean was to be civilized, and the Greeks believed deeply in bathing not daily but regularly. If you were wealthy, you visited public baths with elaborate stone basins and servants who poured warm water from amphorae. If poor, you scraped off oil and dirt at home, rubbing your skin with powdered pumice or fine sand. The gymnasium was as much a place for bathing and grooming as it was for exercise and philosophy. A man might bathe in cold water after wrestling, apply olive oil to his limbs, then recline on a stone bench while a slave scraped away the mixture with a strigil. Women, kept largely indoors, used smaller setups, bowls, and jugs, with oil for cleansing and rose water for scent. The act of cleaning was sensual, yes, but also moral. Greek writers often compared physical cleanliness to mental purity. To neglect your hygiene was to invite chaos into the body, and that, to a Greek mind, was almost political. In Rome, bathing became a public obsession. The great thermomassive bath complexes were the pride of the empire. A Roman citizen might spend hours at the baths, moving from hot to cold rooms, scraping, soaking, sweating, resting. But this was more than hygiene. It was social life, business, relaxation, and medical theory all wrapped together. The body was oiled before entering, then scrubbed and scraped. Soap still hadn't arrived in common usage. Instead, Romans relied on mixtures of oil, sand, and sometimes even urine to soften calluses or bleach fabrics. The skin was scraped, not soaped, and yet they were obsessed with odor. Perfumes were mixed with wine and resin. Some added cinnamon or lavender oil to their bathwater. Women might use lead-based powders to soften their skin, unaware of the danger. The goal was smoothness, not sterility. The idea of killing bacteria didn't exist. But they knew something about cleanliness. That filth brought disease. That shared water had to be monitored. Bathhouses even had attendants who cleaned the floors between uses with rags and vinegar. Further east, in ancient China, cleanliness was bound to philosophy. Confucianism stressed ritual purity, and hygiene reflected inner discipline. Baths were taken with boiled water, herbs, or fermented rice. Hair was washed less often but brushed and oiled carefully. Combs were carved from ivory or wood, passed down like heirlooms. Nails were kept short and clean, not out of vanity but to reflect self-control. Scent mattered, but so did silence. Some households burned small coils of incense during bathing, to calm the mind. Water was sometimes heated with stones, poured into bronze basins, and used one limb at a time. In wealthier homes, servants prepared bath mixtures with camellia oil, ginger, or bean flour. Cleanliness here was not just external, it was tied to health, to harmony, to ki. And even when illness struck, bathing and cleansing remained a first step toward healing. Doctors advised wiping down the body with salt water or vinegar, rinsing the mouth, washing the soles of the feet. These actions were not scientific, but they were effective in their own way, and so, in every corner of the ancient world, people stayed clean not with soap, but with what they had: water, ash, oil, sand, herbs. The rituals differed, but the impulse was the same. To be clean was to be proper, to be safe, to be part of the world around you in the right way. And always, these acts were quiet. You could measure the discipline of a household by how often its basins were scrubbed, how its linen smelled, how its children were taught to wash their hands after handling food or animals. These were not laws. These were habits passed down, refined, repeated. The kind of wisdom that doesn't show up in history books, but lives in generations. The kind of hygiene that happens when no one is watching. But if ancient people managed to stay clean with oil and vinegar, why did soap eventually become the symbol of health, class, and even morality in later history? The first time someone boiled animal fat with ash, it probably wasn't on purpose. Maybe it was during a fire, a spill, a lazy moment of waste disposal in a muddy pit somewhere outside Babylon. The residue that formed greasy, sticky, strangely effective, was likely noticed by someone not looking to invent anything, just trying to wash their hands or a pot. And over time, the discovery was refined. By 2800 BCE, the Sumerians had something like soap, not for their skin, but for cloth, hair, and wounds. It was not fragrant or foamy. It stung. It was harsh. But it worked. The earliest soaps were strong, greyish lumps used to scour grease from wool, or as a poultice for skin infections. In the ancient world, these blocks were useful but rare, and almost no one would willingly rub them on their body every day. Instead, soap lived on the margins of life, part medicine, part cleaning tool, tucked in with laundry gear, or among jars in an apothecary's corner. In Egypt, soap-like pastes were used in mummification. In Gaul, a tribe known for their elaborate hairstyles made a rudimentary soap from animal tallow and wood ash to keep their locks upright and pale. But even then, no one confused soap with hygiene, not. Yet it was in the Roman world that things began to shift. Pliny the Elder mentions a soap called sapo, used by the Gauls and Germans to dye hair red and blonde. Roman doctors experimented with soap as a skin treatment. But still, most Romans continued to rely on oil, water, and scraping. Soap remained a foreign curiosity. Even in the baths of Carthage or Antioch, you'd be more likely to see perfumes, pumice, or vinegar than a proper bar of anything solid and sudsy. The same was true in early Islamic societies, where cleanliness was of immense religious importance. Bathing was frequent, rigorous, and deeply ritualized, but still not reliant on soap. And yet, it was in the Islamic Golden Age, between the 7th and 12th centuries, that true soap as we know it began to emerge. Artisans in Syria and Persia developed methods for making smoother, scented bars using vegetable oils like olive or laurel, mixed with lye derived from burnt plant matter. Aleppo soap, green and mild, became famous for its quality. It could clean without burning. It could smell good. And suddenly, soap became more than functionally it. Became pleasant, desired, even luxurious, as trade expanded across the Mediterranean. And into Europe, soap followed. In places like Marseille, Nablus, and Venice, new regional soaps developed olive oil-based, hardened, refined. Soap makers became guild members. Recipes were guarded, and soap began to show up in wealthier homes, especially among merchants and nobles who could afford to import it or have it made locally. But even into the 17th century, most people still washed the old way. Soap was expensive, and bathing still carried suspicion in some corners of Europe. Hot water, according to some doctors, opened the pores to disease. Cold bathing was considered bracing but dangerous. Linen was changed often. Skin was scrubbed with cloth, not lathered. In many households, soap was reserved for laundry. You could live your whole life without ever touching it.
Then came the Enlightenment, and with it, revolutions not just in science and medicine, but in morality. Cleanliness began to be tied not just to health, but to virtue. If you were clean, you were godly. If you were dirty, you were poor, lazy, or untrustworthy. Soap, especially scented soap, became part of the daily life of the rising bourgeoisie in England. Perfumed soaps made from palm and tallow were sold in apothecaries and by traveling vendors. In France, soap makers served royal courts. In Germany and the Netherlands, cleanliness campaigns linked public order to private hygiene. And during the Industrial Revolution, soap became cheap enough for the middle class. Factories produced it in slabs. Advertisements promised brighter skin, sweeter breath, a better life. And slowly, soap crept from the linen room into the wash basin, then the medicine cabinet, then the bedroom. By the 19th century, Victorians considered it scandalous not to own soap. Soap was not just about being clean. It was about being good. But this civilizing mission had a cost. As Europe expanded through colonization, so did its soap. Colonial officers brought crates of carbolic soap into Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, framing cleanliness as a tool of moral superiority. Indigenous practices long based on plant oils, clays, and ashes were dismissed as primitive. The British even made soap part of missionary kits in India. Soap was introduced as part of imperial hygiene reform in the Philippines. American school teachers taught children to use Western soap alongside English grammar. By the 20th century, soap was everywhere. It was rationed during wartime. It was advertised on radio. It was used as propaganda. It was shaped into babies, scented like roses, embossed with names, and eventually, it became invisible, so common, so assumed that no one questioned it. But it was never just about being clean. It was about the idea of clean, how it should smell, feel, look. The old way, scraping with oil, washing with sand, bathing with herbs, still existed. In rural parts of India, Africa, and the Middle East, people continued to use ash, mud, and plant-based paste well into the 21st century. But the dominance of bar soap and later liquid soap reshaped our rituals. It turned a slow, thoughtful process into a fast, foamy routine. It created an illusion that with enough product, you could scrub the day away entirely. And maybe that's the biggest difference of all. In the ancient world, Cleansing was an active return to balance, to breath, to the self. Today, it often feels like an escape, a reset button. But somewhere, under the bubbles, there is still something ancient, the need to feel whole again. Even if just for a moment. And as you dry your hands with a towel, or step from a hot shower into cold air, you might wonder, what will future people think of our rituals of cleanliness? Will our soap seem crude, excessive, or beautiful? Will our obsession with clean still matter in a world that may one day run short on water again?